Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a second. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose Live. We're really excited to be here tonight with Natasha Trethewey in conversation with Lisa Page. Before we get started, I just have some quick housekeeping notes for everyone. The first thing is that we really encourage everybody to purchase a copy of tonight's book, Memorial Drive. If you look in the chat, I've posted a link to purchase the book at politicsandprose.com. It's a great way to support our author, and it's also a great way to support your local independent bookstore. The second thing I'd like to let everyone know is that the last 20 minutes or so of tonight's talk will be dedicated to your questions, and we really encourage everyone to submit their questions. You can do that by clicking on the Q&A button. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a Q&A button. Just click there and type in your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So with that out of the way, it is my honor to introduce Natasha Trethewey to Politics and Prose Live. She is a two-time U.S. Poet Laureate, and she has published 5 books of poetry and won a Pulitzer Prize for her 2007 collection, Native Guard. Tonight she'll be discussing her new book, Memorial Drive, A Daughter's Memoir, which is a powerful meditation on sudden loss and absence, and also a piercing glimpse at the enduring effects of white racism and domestic abuse. Tonight, she will be in conversation with Lisa Page, co-editor of We Wear the Mask, 15 True Stories of Passing in America, and also an assistant professor of English at the George Washington University. So without any further ado, Natasha and Lisa, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and it is such a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with Natasha Trethewey at Politics and Prose Bookstore. And my first question for you, Natasha, is what was the catalyst for Memorial Drive, A Daughter's Memoir? What made you write this book?
I think I had to write it because I really needed the world to understand that I'm a writer because of my mother, because of the deep wound that doesn't heal, because of losing her. And it really became so necessary for me to write it. After a lot of my own success as a writer, the more attention that I got, the more my backstory was included in the stories written about me. And in the backstory, there was mention of my mother only as a footnote or an afterthought. And I decided that if she was going to be mentioned as this victim or this murdered woman, that I needed to be the person to tell her story so that it could be understood and that she could be in her proper context as the resilient, smart, powerful woman who made me.
I love that. And you come from a long line of strong women, actually. Would you talk about that? The grandmother who slept with a pistol under her pillow and who gave birth by herself. Would you talk a little bit about these women?
Yes, you know, my grandmother was tough as nails, as was my great aunt Sugar, her older sister by 10 years. My grandmother, it's a great story about having to give birth by herself and lie there for a long time until the doctor could get there. Still joined, the umbilical cord still connecting her with my mother, which becomes a powerful metaphor, obviously, for that enduring connection between mother and daughter. But it's a line, a through line, I feel, straight from my grandmother through my mother down to me as well. My grandmother also participated in acts of civil disobedience and protest, including protesting the Biloxi Wade-In, taking part in the Biloxi Wade-In, in which protesters were demanding the right for Blacks to use the public beaches that they were denied using. She also had all sorts of little everyday acts of resistance to maintain her dignity in the face of a society that would find so many ways to try to demean and degrade her.
You had another grandmother too, a grandmother named Narcissus, who was you describe as a color-struck woman. Would you tell that story as well?
Yeah, my great grandmother Narcissus, whom I've never met, but the story about her is that she was my mother's father's mother, and that she was so light skinned that she passed for white. She could pass for white, and was not pleased that my grandfather had married a woman as dark skinned as my grandmother. So she wanted to make sure that indeed this child that this woman was having was actually her son's child. And so she came down to New Orleans, where my mother was born, and to see her and to make sure that she had the marking that she thought, that Narcissus believed she passed on. And that was a birthmark, a red birthmark at the base of the skull. And indeed, my mother had it, but she was too brown for Narcissus.
So this is what's so fascinating about the memoir, is how many, layers you have going in terms of women, in terms of race, and in terms of men. And one other part about this, your background, is that some men are missing, that they are absent. Your mother's father shows up late. That's why one of the reasons why she gives birth by herself. Correct?
Well, so my mother's father, my grandfather Ralph, turned out to be a bigamist. He was away at sea in the Navy when my grandmother gave birth, because he had just shipped out in New Orleans. But so my grandmother's father was absent in her life. My mother's father, for that reason, as a bigamist, was absent in her life. My father was not exactly absent. He was away. I mean, they were divorced, and I only saw him in the summer, but he continued to be part of my life in ways that the other men in the family were not. I see something weird happening behind me. Should I adjust this? That's like the sun coming in powerfully.
And yeah, I can't see you anymore.
I can't see anything.
Wow.
That is some powerful sunlight.
Yes.
Let me see if I can just sit somewhere else. Forgive me.
Oh, no worries. Much better over there.
Yeah, what if I go this way?
There you go. Perfect. That's much better.
Sorry. Okay.
You were saying about the absence of some of the men.
Yeah. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I think that certainly played a big part in how my mother came to understand the role of men in her own life. A very difficult part to have been without her own father, and then she later on had a stepfather that my strong grandmother didn't stay married to very long because he wouldn't work. This is one of the other things that I talk about in the book. My great aunt Sugar constantly said, don't ever marry a man with less education than you, because they knew the dangers of that.
Yes. So that's, and that, yeah. And then there is also the situation where men are a little too present later on in the book, which is your mother's ex-husband. But let's not quite go there yet. The other thing I found so fascinating was sort of the intersection of the Old South and the New South, and how this affects your mother. She's born into the Jim Crow South, and she moves in. Would you talk about that a little bit and what that meant for her?
Yeah. So you know, I was trying to contrast the lives that my parents had early on. My father, who was my white parent, born in Canada, in rural Nova Scotia, 1943, and my mother in Mississippi in 1944. Just the experience of coming into being, coming of age as a Black girl in the Jim Crow South was markedly different from my father's experience. Um, and I think shaped her sense of um, striving for social justice.
Absolutely. And how her how she saw things change so radically. But she also made a radical change for women in her time, to marry your father. That was uncommon.
Right. It was, you know, and they met in an odd way. I mean, my father from Canada got out a guide to American colleges and universities to find one that he could afford and that would offer him a track scholarship. He didn't realize at first that it was an HBCU, historically Black college and university, but he showed up there anyway, and that's where he met my mother. And so, you know, he was one of only, you know, maybe 2 or 3 white guys on the entire campus, and he stayed there and graduated from Kentucky State College.
I love that story. I also love the description you have of him being the only white player in the Black baseball game on the
Right.
Mississippi with your family, and yeah,
That's right.
yeah, he's a. So there's that intersection of the old South and the new South, and how that affected your mother. But there's also the interracial marriage, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to read a little bit for us. On page 33, you talk about your biracial identity and how fraught it was. You've given us sort of a build-up until then about how your mother was very pragmatic about you, about what your life would be like. Your father, on the other hand, as a white man, was much more idealistic. He wasn't as sort of aware or steeped in, you know, the lost cause and all the things that your mother knew very well about. Would you be willing to read for us?
Sure. When I began to go out with both my parents, outside of the confines of North Gulfport to a store or the movie theater, I watched the ways white people responded to us. That my parents were beautiful would have been reason enough to stare. But in Mississippi, in the late 60s and early 70s, it had only been a few years since the beaches were integrated to comply with national law, and the schools were yet to be fully desegregated across the state. Ross Barnett, the former governor, was monitoring interracial activity, and my grandmother had been on the list of people to watch ever since she tried to place my parents' 1965 wedding announcement in the local newspaper. Separation of the races was still the way of things, maintained by custom, if not upheld by law, and my parents and I met with a great deal of hostility most places we went. I could see it on the faces of the white people we encountered, how even the nicer ones just shook their heads, whispering, "Such a cute little thing, too bad she's Black." How others stared at us, sucking their teeth. Sometimes this hostility turned to outright intimidation, someone following us out of Woolworths to the car, my mother gripping my father's arm to prevent him turning around and engaging the man behind us. Someone else driving slowly by the house, glaring at us as we sat on the front porch. A group of 3 or 4 men accosting my father on his way home from work on the docks, asking, "What's wrong with you? Why you living among the niggers?"
Thank you. So that sets up your life and your feelings about the world you're born into, which I thought was so poignant around you setting it up for the reader, the discomfort of how your father would be called sir, and treated like a gentleman, but your mother was called gal, as opposed to ma'am.
Yeah, they're miss, never any proper terms. Yeah. Just diminishment.
Absolutely. And the diminishment again it's a racial diminishment, but it's also a gender diminishment, and that is so it's searingly powerful in this book. How she's treated throughout her life, and how she's treated, how her death is treated. So you also talk about the power of words, of your own discovery of language, and that starts very early. Your father plays with the idea of the word mulatto by posing you on a. Well, would you talk about that too, please?
Yeah, this is one of the things that I reflect upon, because, you know, my father so believed that I needed, as Robert Frost put it, my proper poetical education in the metaphor, that I needed to have a strong grasp of figurative values. But it's funny that in so doing, he might not even recognize the extent to which I needed those figurative values, even to understand the things that he was doing or how he engaged me. I mean, it was my father who, you know, taught me the term Heinz 57 for a person who's all mixed up.
Oh,
Um,
I haven't heard that one.
yes, that I was a Heinz 57. But also, so I mentioned in the book, though, this scene in which a photograph of me taken in Mexico, where we went for a family vacation in a place that my father felt my mother would be able to relax, because we might not be looked at in quite the same way as in the US. But there, I was put on the back of a mule, and it was sort of my father's joke, that the mixed race child would be riding her namesake, the mulatto, on the mule.
It's very heavy.
But it is sort of this idea, you know, that Frost writes about, that if you don't understand metaphor, you're not safe in science, you're not safe in history. And so it makes sense that I need to understand exactly how my father might play with imagery in that way, the sight gag, but also understanding something about the laws of Mississippi, anti-miscegenation laws.
Yes, right. And those were very much in play when you were born. So, I mean, it was illegal. They had to leave the state, didn't they, to get married?
That's right. They had to go all the way to Cincinnati to get married. And so not only was it illegal to marry in the state of Mississippi, and also in the state of Kentucky where they were in school, it was also illegal to leave the state to go somewhere where interracial marriage was legal and then come back. So they broke their second law by coming back to Mississippi.
Wow. Well, they were both rebels.
Yeah.
They both did what they wanted to do, given the circumstances they were up against, which I personally admire. But so you talk about the power of words, of metaphor, of language throughout this book, and also um, uh, metaphor is, I mean, would you talk about Memorial Drive? Why this is called Memorial Drive?
Mm-hmm. Well, there is both the literal and the figurative with that as well. My mother died on Memorial Drive, which is um, road named to remember and honor the Confederate soldiers. It starts in the center of downtown Atlanta and runs all the way to the base of Stone Mountain, upon which is the largest monument to the Confederacy in the nation. But it also speaks to um, my entire project as a writer, to be driven by um, the desire to remember and to memorialize and to create in words a monument to my mother.
That's so beautifully said. Um, are there any protests on Memorial Drive in Atlanta that you know of?
You know, I don't know. I can only imagine that there must be. I'm I'm waiting to hear what they'll figure out to do with Stone Mountain, how to tell a fuller version of the history of that monument there, which wasn't finished until 1972, the year that my mother and I moved to Atlanta.
Wow. So many historic events that happened over the course of your mother's life and your life. But that drive, you describe it so well. And again, it's the intersection of the old South and the new, because Atlanta is also, when you moved there with your mother, a very hip place to be, right? It's become the new South, and the civil rights movement has happened. Would you talk about that?
Yeah, my mother, when she visited Atlanta, when she was still in college, I think she really saw it as a place of great possibility, where, unlike Mississippi, a place that she might have a different kind of career and a different life. Atlanta, in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, had been nicknamed the city too busy to hate, which is an odd way of thinking about it. Like, well, if we weren't busy, would we hate? But instead, it became sort of the representation of the beacon of the New South. And not long after, a Black mayor. So it did seem to be a place of possibility, and yet it was also deeply entrenched and racist in other ways that we encountered pretty soon after we got there.
Yes, and she also went to work in the Atlanta Underground, which I remember that place. Yes, and I remember thinking it was so hip. It was so exciting to go there. So you as a poet understand the power of imagery, of objects, and that she wears this belt of bullets that's part of her uniform for her job. Am I correct about that? Yeah. And the irony of that, and that she obviously was bullets ended her life. These are the real you left me speechless at times over things like this, because you're writing about the unspeakable. You speak about the unspeakable in terms of how women have been in these horrific domestic abuse situations. I always feel like domestic abuse is a very poor way to describe what women go through, what many people go through with abusive households. But you also write about silence. So as you find your voice and you find language, you also negotiate silence. And would you talk about that as well, your own silence? And I also wondered about your mother's silence. When you come back from your grandmother's, you've been in the summer in Mississippi, and you come back and your mother's married and has a new baby, and she's pretty silent about it. So I'm just asking you to talk about silence.
Yeah, I think part of it for my mother must have been a little bit about respectability, that you kept certain secrets in order to give a good face to the world. I'm stunned at how deeply I took to heart the adage that children are to be seen and not heard. That's, I think, part of what kept me from thinking that I should break my own silence and tell her what it is that I was going through. I thought it was my place to stay quiet. But of course, there is the kind of unspeakable silence that even now doesn't make sense to me. I think I've come to understand from talking to other survivors of a kind of violence that abusers don't even necessarily have to tell you not to tell. Somehow the silence is baked into the abuse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think finding a voice and finally being able to speak out is the kind of power and agency that is necessary to squash that silence that would otherwise destroy you.
And you are so brave in this book, in even even showing us, the reader, your heartbreak about this. That you know, as a child, you wanted nothing more than to please your mother. You thought being quiet was the right way to go. Now, in retrospect, it's all of those pieces tie in with the subject of abuse and all the ways that we doubt ourselves, as opposed to laying the blame where it belongs. However, I think you do put the blame where it belongs, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about your description of Joel Grimmett, Big Joe, and how was the process of writing about this man, with his bulging eye and his strange toes and his brutality? Would you talk about your process writing about him?
You know, the one thing that I kept in my head the whole time that I was describing him was that he had been a child once. He too had been an innocent. Something in the world happened to him that could disfigure his soul.
Mm-hmm.
Everything perhaps from something in his childhood to his time in Vietnam. He was a disfigured and wounded soul. And I think we have to remember that for the possibility of restorative justice.
I think what you're saying is also, it sounds almost like you forgive him, or you've worked to forgive him.
You know, I don't know. I don't know that I think about it in terms of forgiveness.
Okay.
I think that's why restorative justice is a better way of thinking about it.
Okay.
I don't think it's necessary that I forgive him. It is only necessary that I remember his own humanity.
Yes. Thank you. That's a much better way to describe it. So that also, it's misogyny here, right? It's a damaged man. Again, it's this sort of the intersection too of male entitlement and female vulnerability. And yet your mother, as a strong woman, does leave him, puts him in prison. Would you talk about that, please?
Well, you know, one thing that I think we need to remember is that, you know, just how hard it is and the amount of bravery it takes for a woman to come forward and confront her abuser, to tell people, to get away. The statistics suggest that you are more likely to die at the hands of your abusive partner for leaving than for staying. Your chances of dying increase, you know, a great percentage when you make the decision to leave. And so people often think, you know, why do these women stay? Why would someone stay? Well, it's really hard to get away. And my mother's case is illustrative of that, I think. My mother is someone who was educated. She had a master's of social work. She was well connected, loved. She had resources, friends. She wasn't dependent on her abuser for shelter or the care of her children. If a woman like that can't escape, how can we tell poor women or uneducated women or women who are dependent on their abusers that they can get away? Especially knowing that getting away might lead to an escalation of violence and even death.
So true. You have transcripts from your mother. Would you talk a little bit about that process and how you came to have those?
Serendipity. I moved back to Atlanta in 2001 to take a job. And I just, in 2005, just by chance, was seen walking by a man who was at this time an assistant district attorney, but who before had been the first police officer on the scene the day of my mother's murder. And he recognized me when he saw me and told me that they purged the records of cases after 20 years. And so these files were about to be purged, and he gave them to me.
It's almost like, it's amazing that happened.
I think of it as just part of, when I think about the stars lining up, as I talk about, or destiny, the proximity, that sort of putting myself in the places that might allow for those kinds of things to happen. I mean, Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. I'm going to move again because I can see yet again that the sun is just having its way with me. So I think of it as it's like the image that I try to create of my mother. That is exactly what's hitting me right now, right in the center of my face. So I'm going to turn around again. And now I'm slightly blinded by
well, we can see you very clearly, though.
Okay.
So that yes, you show your mother as luminous. Many of the images of her are literally full of light, and then the scenes of her dancing at parties and celebrating, and she's like a ball of light, just really luminous. So my other question for you is about, you're a poet. How was this process of writing this book, since you look for the image, since you look for the line, how did that feed into writing your memoir?
Well, I still wanted the music of language. And so fortunately, I'm in love with sentences and the rhythm of syntax that can make the mind leap to an apprehension of things that might not otherwise be readily apparent. So I couldn't work within the line because obviously it wasn't poetry, but I could still work with the sentence as a way to create that kind of musicality and lyricism. I think, it is harder for me to fill up the whole page, but I liked having a little bit more space to move around in. I felt like this required, it required a much bigger place in which to have this meditation. But even as I was writing it, it felt not unlike writing a long poem or a sequence that I was putting together that would ultimately be like a long prose poem.
Interesting, because you also have interludes of dreams here, dreams of your mother, dreams, but other dreams as well. That, for me, they were like stanzas. They were something else, that a new idea that got um, uh, included in the narrative, but a new idea, a new image. So really beautifully done. So in a moment, we're going to open it up to questions. But I do have a question. I have gotten one question already that I do want to ask you, which is, how has writing this book changed you?
Well, I think that it has made me confront my own complicity in a kind of willed forgetting. I mean,
How so?
well, you know, when I wrote the other book that was dedicated to her, which was a collection of poems, you know, that book came out in 2006, and I was very concerned with historical memory, with collective memory, and I would stomp my feet and insist that remembering our history, and I still say this, especially as we watch our new reckoning over Confederate monuments and symbols, I would insist the necessity for remembering our history, our shared history. But And I was angry at my nation for that kind of willed amnesia and willed forgetting that you see when only parts of our story are told, when there aren't hundreds of monuments to African American soldiers who fought for the Union to save it and for their own freedom. I mean, imagine the difference if the landscape were populated with monuments to the actual winners of the Civil War in the South, Black soldiers. We would tell a very different story than what we've been telling. So with all that in mind, I didn't want to admit that some forgetting might be necessary. Some forgetting might be important to survive. Even now, I'm not sure if there are things that I have buried that are lost to me forever. I realized in writing this book that I don't have as much of her, that I can't remember as much as I wish I could right now. My memory of her is so episodic.
And yet she's alive, and you brought her to life. And that is huge, in my opinion. She's a living, breathing, spirit in this book. She's not a statistic. She is an example of so many women who get erased, who become, just another number, and you've made her human. In terms of memory, and I'm older than you, it may come back to you. I had all kinds of memories reading this book that I had forgotten, that just suddenly, some things that I didn't want to remember suddenly just popped up.
Well, there's hope for me yet.
There is.
I did feel in the writing that the act of writing would make things come back that I'd forgotten. Like trying to remember going downtown New Orleans with her, when we'd ride the streetcar. As I was writing that section, all of a sudden these words came back to me: Godchaux's, Maison Blanche, D.H. Holmes, names of department stores, some of them gone, some of them not, but that I hadn't thought about for years. And there they were, and there we were together in them. So it came back like that a little bit.
Oh, that's so great. All right, we have some questions, and I'm just going to look in this little right now. This question is compliments how powerful the work is, and how. Wait a minute, I just got two different things pop up in here. Also about forgetting. Do we purposely forget, or are we so wrapped up in our own lives that it just doesn't sink in? That's the question. Do we not absorb information? And I think trauma definitely sometimes. Well, I'll let you answer the question.
Well, I mean, trauma certainly sears itself, in your brain and in your body in different ways than other kinds of things that you might remember or forget. I think on a national level, if the question means that, the willed forgetting is about telling ourselves stories that we're more comfortable with.
Yes.
Do you want to tell a story? If you only want to tell a story about American exceptionalism and righteousness, then you're not going to allow any knowledge about American racism and oppression and the way that it's sort of baked into the founding of this nation. You're not going to allow yourself to remember that. You're going to try to erase it at every turn and erect monuments that tell a different story. I think on a personal level, we also tell stories to ourselves that make us look better in the telling. Who wants to remember, an encounter where you were not at your personal best? And in the retelling, you might embellish so that to yourself, you're a better person. I mean, that's the way that memory kind of is always being revised.
Absolutely.
And our stories are always being shaped, the stories we tell ourselves.
Yes, and memoir is an example of shaping memory. Another question here, what does it mean to be a poet writing a memoir?
Well, that's an interesting question. Well, for me, it meant that while working on certain parts of the memoir in prose, I would have to stop and turn the page over and write a poem, because some things still came out of me as poems, even as I was working on the memoir. So, the first poem in my last book, which was my new and selected, is a poem called Imperatives for Carrying On in the Aftermath. And it's about a response to all the kinds of ridiculous things that people say about domestic violence. So it certainly could have been part of this prose memoir, and yet it poemed up in me and I had to stop and write it.
Fascinating. Another question is about red flag laws, which I have never heard of. And the writer asks if your mother could have been saved if red flags laws had been in place. Are you familiar with that term?
One of the laws, there were no anti-stalking laws in place when my mother was killed. That came later. So maybe if that's what the writer is asking about. Although I wonder, I think perhaps had the anti-stalking laws been in place um, when she was still alive, she might not have had to go through, all the steps she took just to try to get a warrant for his arrest. Those transcripts, the 2 days of taped phone calls, because nothing else they had was enough to issue an arrest warrant. So I think, laws like that might have helped her. I mean, remember, he'd already tried to kill her once and was sent to jail the year before for that, and then got out and just started stalking her and making terroristic threats all over again.
And he's out now, right? He was released in March 2020. Do I have that correct?
It was in March of 2019, yes.
2019. Okay, I've got that. Another question is about how you process grief about your mother's death, and how you process that grief, and what made it possible for you to write this book.
Well, I think that the process of grief is ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm processing it right now.
Yes.
This is how I understand it. People often ask whether or not this book brought me any healing. I don't think there is any healing. This is a wound that never heals. Mm-hmm. What I can do is give it a kind of palliative care, which means I can keep it clean. I can expose it to light. I can do certain things that might relieve some of the pain occasionally and keep it from festering. But it is a wound I have to live with. It's not going away.
No.
It's not healing, but there's palliative care.
I love that. I love that that's the way you're approaching it, because palliative care is about lessening pain, making comfort, and making friends with death. Frankly, that's okay. I've got some more questions here. Many people are writing in and thanking you so much for your bravery in telling this story. How do you remain connected to your heritage, and what are your wishes for your future? What do you recommend Black women do to fight invisibility?
I feel like I carry, my heritage with me. It is, I think, indistinguishable from who I am. I think this is why I use those lines from Shakespeare's sonnet number 3 as an epigraph. Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. I want to walk through the world as the reflection of my mother and as the reflection of my people. Mm-hmm. I think we are constantly fighting erasure, constantly fighting being diminished. I think telling our own stories in this way and continuing to remind the world that these stories matter just as much as any other stories, that these stories teach us not only about the individual Black women whose lives they come from, but they tell us about ourselves, our larger humanity. And when we value everyone's life as much and equally, then no stories will be lost and erased. And we're in a moment where we're fighting very hard for that.
Yes.
And the world is watching.
And the world is participating.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
There's another question here about the documents you use in the second half of the book, the transcripts that include your mother's voice. And the question is about your decision to break out of your role as narrator and instead to present your mother as she actually spoke. And she asks you to talk about that choice.
Well, it was a hard choice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've always, as a writer, cleaved to documentary evidence because of the way that it convinces us with its facts. In this case, I worried that there would be some readers who would think that I wasn't telling the story if I gave the story over to the documentary evidence. And yet, I also thought that me trying to tell you how smart and resilient and brave and calm my mother was would just sound like a daughter praising her own mother. I wanted you to see it for yourself. I wanted you to hear it in her own words, because I think it is an incontrovertible fact when you hear her voice, when you hear her own words, that can convince you way more than me telling you how amazing she was.
Yes, it really, really works. And it's also shows her in a way, you're right, that she's telling the story. She takes over telling the story um, uh, as opposed to your picture of your mother. And many people are also writing about their heart going out to you, Natasha. And one question asks, from whom do you draw the strength to live with the wounds of your mother's loss and abuse?
Well, I think her first, her example. You know, I live by her example of fierce love that she had for me. Um, and I'm lucky too to have had, you know, my grandmother and my father and my extended family. Um, I always felt powerfully loved. And I think that those early years are so, those formative years in a child's life are so significant because they buoy you, they stay with you forever.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. And what happened to your father is another question here.
Well, my father died in 2014. I thought I was going to have him for a long time.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you did. I'm sorry about that, though. Okay. Let's see here. You are a phenomenal woman. You have so much strength. I so appreciate the raw emotions that you brought to this evening. How do we continue to advocate for fairness in pay in the publishing industry and beyond? Yes, our stories do matter so significantly.
Yeah, I think the writer said it. You know, if we collectively understand that the stories of women, of African Americans, and other minorities are as valuable as the stories of whites, then we should pay the same for those stories. We should value in the publishing industry those stories just as much as we value the stories that have long been told to us were universal, because these stories are filled with the same universal material as any other human story. When we acknowledge that, then we all win.
Yes, and there's another question here. How are family members responding to the publishing of the memoir?
My brother is very happy about it. Yeah.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, I think he, like me, feels like more people need to know about her.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so good. That's so important. So we just have a few minutes left. I'll see if we can squeeze one more question in here. Uh, well, I'll close with this. You're being thanked by several people for talking about memory, for talking about its complexity, and for coming forward with your mother's story and your own story. How brave you are to have done this, which for me, the idea of sitting with this, and how long did it take you to write this?
7 years.
7 years. That's a long time, and that's a lot of. So I can only imagine the pages that didn't make it in here.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much for this evening, Natasha Trethewey, and I wish you so much luck
Thank
going
you.
forward.
Thank you.